Today we're going to talk about how to make what I think is better cold brew coffee. Now, to define cold brew very quickly, it is coffee brewed where the water at the time of brewing is room temperature to cold. It's not the thing that typically I've enjoyed and recommended on this channel, which is hot brewed coffee iced down to chill and diluted to a kind of normal strength, enjoyed chilled over ice. This is all about brewing with cool water, a very different flavour profile. Historically, I've preferred the hot brewed over iced because you get a little bit more complexity from the coffee that you're starting with. But people really like cold brew, and so we took a fresh look at it, did a bunch of experimentation, and I want to share some really interesting stuff that we found along the way. This isn't about one singular recipe. I want to help you make better cold brew for you. That'll be about technique, sure, but also about the kind of coffee that you're going to use. All of that will be covered and more. Now, at the start of this whole process, we laid out what we thought were problems worth solving with cold brew. Now, we didn't say taste was a problem worth solving. There was some other stuff that we were kind of interested in. First, and perhaps not the most obvious one, but actually a really big deal for me, is the fact that cold brew is really wasteful. It's unnecessarily expensive. It uses a lot of coffee, basically. Your typical coffee to water ratio is at least 1 to 10. That's a lot of coffee. And the downside of this is that you're not going to get all of the good flavour out of the grounds using traditional methods, which means that you have bought, paid for, received, and then thrown away good tasting stuff. That's not okay. We don't want that. We want to get better value for money from the coffee that we're spending if we're buying really great coffee. There's no point throwing it away. So that was the first thing we needed to approach. And I'll explain why it's a problem in a minute, but I'll get into the second thing. The second issue that we wanted to overcome was what I kind of felt was like cold brew taste, but not the taste of just brewing with cold water, the taste that you tend to have happen over time as your cold brew ages and begins to effectively oxidize. There's a different sort of flavor that comes out in sort of older cold brews that has a incredibly generic flavor to it. I don't enjoy that flavor, but also it completely masks whatever coffee you are brewing. And so for us, can we avoid this? Is there an approach to this that sort of helps with that problem? You may like the sort of low acid, heavy body of cold brew, but you may not like that sort of weird, slightly vegetably chocolatey taste that tends to come out after a little while. So we try to fix that. And then the last one, of course, is flavour. How far can we go in the world of flavour? There's a big constraint. The water is cold. You don't have the heat necessary to extract certain compounds. Some people like the results, but can we get more from the coffees that we're dealing with? So that's how we set out. Now let me explain the problem with traditional cold brew, why it's so wasteful. This is a toddy brewer. That's the brand that makes it. I suspect there's a bunch of generic ones that people still call toddy. It's a very simple system. You have a big buckety thing, you got a little bung at the bottom, and inside is going to be your filtration, actually. So you have an option of 2 levels of filtration. You can go for just the sort of almost felt filter, for want of a better term, that sits in there. And then you can also use a paper bag. Now, that sounds bad, doesn't it, when I say you can just use a paper bag? A specific coffee paper bag. It's quite a bit thinner than sort of filter papers that you would use in a pour over. You can see through it very easily. You go in, your coffee and water go in here, scrunch it down, seal it up, let it steep. The problem with almost all cold brew is the moment of filtration. This isn't the easiest thing to illustrate, but we'll try. If you take hot water and mix it with coffee and cold water and mix it with coffee, and you just try and filter those two things out, you'll see a massive difference. The hot will filter relatively quickly, the cold will take a really, really, really long time. Separating cold water from ground coffee is difficult to do. A brewer like this will approach filtration in this kind of 2-step way and use 2 actually quite minimal filters. The paper's very thin, so it's quite easy to get through. It's not a super effective filter. And then the cloth filter part of it is also pretty easy for stuff to get through. And that helps, but not nearly as much as the recommendation to just grind a fair bit coarser. That means that you can much more easily separate the coffee from the water. But the problem with grinding coarse is that your end result will be weaker. It won't necessarily taste sour the way a hot brew would, because we're brewing with cold water, we don't get those kind of flavors. Instead, you just get a kind of empty, weak brew. What's the solution to that? use more coffee. Use more coffee at a coarser grind will give you a good end strength, but it will mean that you're not properly extracting all the coffee that you have. You'll be throwing good flavour away, and that's not okay. So that's the first thing that we set out to solve. Now, that was one constraint in that we had to work with more sensible coffee to water ratios. Now, when you pour cold coffee over ice, that ice will continue to melt, and so in almost all recipes that end up, making cold coffee, you end up using a slightly higher coffee to water ratio because you know that over the time of drinking this, you'll get some dilution from the ice melting. As such, we didn't stick to 60 grams a litre, but instead we worked at around 70 to 75 grams a litre. Pretty common for most sort of hot iced filter coffee methods. We wanted to have the same thing work here. The additional constraint we had is that we didn't want to use a concentrate. We didn't want to sort of brew something really strong that you keep as a concentrate in the fridge and then dilute as you need. The problem with that, it's very common, it's what Toddy recommend in fact, it is that concentrate will sit there for longer than you want it to. We needed a method that was kind of just in time, but not. Something you might do a day ahead and then drink the next day, rather than try to make a cold brew concentrate for the week, because by day 2, that kind of cold brew taste, the taste of it aging, will become quite loud, and by day 5, 6, 7, extremely dominant. I don't want to get into kind of the food safety of long-term homemade concentrate storages, but generally speaking, I would rather recommend somebody make something the night before to drink the next day and repeat each day. Now, there are other styles of cold brew maker in the market. A lot of people are familiar with the kind of Harrier style ones where you have a central sort of column in which your ground coffee lives surrounded by water around it. Those tend to really struggle, in my experience, with extraction. Certainly if you want to get sort of a good strength from a smaller amount of coffee, that hasn't been particularly successful for me in the past. And so we kind of went back to something simpler, even still. What if we didn't have to filter the ground coffee from the liquid coffee? What if there wasn't this moment of passing it through something that causes all of these headaches? Was there a way around this? Now, if you're familiar with this channel's French press method, a lot of people are, it's I think the most popular video we've ever made. You know that if you steep coffee and water together, over time, they will naturally begin to separate. What if you could accelerate that process and improve that process? Because that was our thinking. We could grind much finer to have an effective infusion brew if we could improve the sort of separation phase of that. So it's going to seem a little extreme, but I'll tell you what we did to approach that. For this project, we went out and bought a bunch of fining agents. Now, in beer making, wine making, fining agents are actually really commonly used to help create a more clarified kind of product. It helps the things that are in solution floating around fall to the bottom. The downside of most fining agents is that they're not vegetarian. They're often made of fish swim bladders. It's called isinglass as a product. We went out, we bought a bunch of different stuff to see which one worked. I will say right now that the one that we liked, we're not, there's no affiliate link here or anything like that, is vegan. It's not made of fish. This is already so weird, isn't it? Anyway, the goal was, can we use a fining agent to improve the process where we take finely ground coffee, not espresso fine, but we'll get to that in a second, cold water, add a little fining agent, mix to combine, and then over time, will the fining agents do its job and pull more stuff that's floating in the liquid out so that we can just pour the brewed coffee out of the top? Turns out, yes, that's basically the answer. That is the answer. That's how we did this. It's not really a spoiler at this point, is it? Let's make some cold brew. This is probably the easiest recipe for coffee stuff we've ever done on the channel, and it's not because we didn't look into more complicated things. There's been a lot of experimentation. In some ways, it's heartening that the simplest one was the best, but also kind of disappointing too. We thought maybe we'd upturn a stone or two and find something new and exciting that would unlock maybe more. That hasn't been the case. We've had the best results, I think, really just chasing grind size as the win. Really getting a good extraction in the coffee does the most, in our opinion, to improve the flavour while also saving you money. Anyway, let's make a litre, a little bit excessive for just me. But we're going to add 75 grams of ground coffee here. In we go slowly. I've chosen a difficult vessel. Now, in terms of grind size, it's hard to communicate. If you have a grinder that has a micron burr gap, we could say somewhere in the region of 250 microns. If you look at this is a kind of typical coarser grind, probably the finer end of what I see recommended for cold brew, but it's a coarser grind setting. In comparison, what we're using here might get you close to sort of mokapot and fine AeroPress, somewhere there, I think is a reasonable place to think about this. Not fully espresso. We found that even with the fining agent, just a bit too powdery at the very fine grind settings for not much more in terms of extraction, which was really interesting. Now we're going to add a litre of water. Room temperature water is fine. I don't think there's an advantage to brewing with cold water, though we did leave this in the refrigerator once it was mixed and beginning to separate. We did experiment with water chemistry. Again, didn't yield a lot in the way of returns. I wouldn't say that it makes no difference to flavour, but it's not actually as intense as it is brewing with hot water and kind of a pour over or something like that. So, you know, ideally relatively soft water, relatively, you know, low in buffer to the point that it doesn't taste weird. But apart from that, just good, clean water, soft, tasty, no off flavours allowed. If you're going to do nothing else but sort of carbon filter it, that would be enough. But soft is probably a little bit better. And then give the mixture a little stir. I appear to have some sort of skull bar spoon. Who would own that? Now for the fining agent, and here's a slightly tricky bit. Generally speaking, you can only buy them in quantities designed for home beer brewing, where you're brewing actually much larger quantities of liquids. We have been, you know, using the same packet that we opened and have kept sort of sealed, clipped closed in the fridge. While it's been open, it's been fine and had no off flavors or no loss of effectiveness over time, but you are going to use a relatively small amount here. We were often brewing 400 mils at a time, just in little sort of deli containers almost, because that's about the easiest thing to do large batches or large numbers of batches with. And we would use 4 drops for 400 mils of water there. So for a litre, 10. And then mix in our friend the fining agent. Now this additional stirring does help a little bit with extraction. And here's another interesting point. The extraction doesn't take very long. Actually, within an hour, this is pretty much as extracted as it's going to get, and leaving it longer did not see particularly notable increases in extraction. And yet we'd recommend, in this case, leaving it for 12 hours. And that's actually because the fining agent takes time. If you want to have the fine pieces of coffee fall to the bottom and separate themselves for you, it just takes time. Now, after 12 hours, it still tastes pretty fresh. You haven't developed much in the way of off flavors. I would recommend putting a lid on this, and we sealed all the samples that we tested during experimentation. I don't know what your fridge smells like. I presume it smells lovely, but if it doesn't smell lovely sometimes fridges don't, I would just want to keep this sealed. That's all I'm saying. Just pop a lid on it. There's no judgment, just lids. Here's a couple we made earlier. Well, yesterday, because today. This one has no fining agents in it, and this one does have fining agents in it. The difference is not profound, but it is noticeable. And at this point, you'll see, I'll lift this up, everything's very settled, very neatly at the bottom here. Isn't that pleasing? And that's for both of them, to the point that you can pretty much just pour them off into a carafe and separate them that way. You don't need to strain them. There's not really much benefit to that. Now be gentle, because you're trying not to mix up everything underneath. Keep an eye on it. You'll see some sediment still pouring. You can choose when you want to stop. Probably squeeze a little bit more out of that in a second. Some little taste. Good health. Even without the fining agent, it's a surprisingly clean mouthfeel. It's not the mouthfeel of an unfiltered French press. The sort of the fining agent, in my experience, just makes it that touch silkier. It's really quite nice. It's generally easier to pour off a little bit more before you start to pour out some of the sediment with it. It's just a cleaner separation of those two. I wouldn't spend a lot of money on it, a lot of time on it, but if I wanted a better result, Well, yeah, that's my preference. It produces a nicer mouthfeel and a slightly higher yield, always important, if you want to avoid any sort of siltiness in that beverage. Let's talk, though, about taste. Now, neither of these are old enough to have developed that sort of typical aged cold brew flavour. You will see people occasionally approaching this in a bunch of ways. They might add something like an antioxidant. Occasionally you'll see people putting ascorbic acid, vitamin C, in their cold brew. That tends to taste weird to me. It does work reasonably effectively, but it does taste a bit weird. And for a lot of people, they're chasing cold brew to sort of flee acidity. They want to get away from acidity in their coffee, and that's what's brought them to cold brew, because ultimately you do just get less acidity in that coffee. But what if you like acidity and you like light roasted coffees? Should you just never cold brew? Does it not matter the quality of coffee that you put in? That was a really interesting question that we also wanted to look at. And so what I'm going to do now is get 5 different coffees, brewed hot, and their respective cold brews. So I can taste them and talk about which aspects of different styles, roast levels, kind of flavor profiles make it from hot coffee to cold brew when brewed this way. Now, if you've been thinking, what's the deal with that beautiful still life over there? Well, I will answer that question. I'll tell you about it in just a second. But related to that, well, first, there's a short ad for this video's sponsor, which is Shopify. Shopify is an incredibly powerful suite of tools designed to help you start, manage, grow your business, whether that's online or in person. I started out using Shopify, I think like 17 years ago, and it's been a huge part of my own journey within business. I've grown businesses using Shopify as the backbone of everything. And honestly, I can't imagine using anything else. You see, for me, it appeals because it's so easy to build something beautiful, customize it, and you know that under the hood is an incredible engine. You can throw thousands of people at the website and it'll never fall down if you're, say, launching a book or a new magazine, or just sell beautiful fine art prints. Well, Shopify is such a perfect fit. You can integrate with other platforms easily. Everything is incredibly robust but easy to use. And at the end of it all is, I think, probably the best performing checkout on the internet. Now, I would say, don't just take my word for it. Go use the link down below. Go to shopify.com/JamesHoffmann or use the QR code on screen and you can get a free trial. And you'll see just how easy it is to build and navigate a store from your perspective and start to imagine the journey your business could take. Thank you so much to Shopify for sponsoring this video. I did say I'd tell you about the picture. This was painted for us by Georgina Stanley, an incredibly talented artist. We really love her still life work in particular. And this was done just for us. And if you want this, well, it's now available down in the description below. So here's the tasting that I'm very much looking forward to. At the front are the hot coffees. And we've got a light roasted washed coffee. We've got a sort of specialty medium, which would be still pretty light in the world of commercial coffee, but it's a little bit more developed. And then we've got a specialty dark. You can certainly go much darker than this, but you don't tend to see that with specialty coffee. We've got a kind of classic natural processed coffee. This one from Honduras. Very carefully done, very well executed. And then we've got an interesting thermal shock coffee. It's had a bunch of anaerobic fermentation done to it, as well as having a thermal shock where it's gone from being hot to cold very quickly as part of the post-harvest process. These are the kind of very fashionable coffees right now, the kind of the noisiest segment of the industry. And so depending on the kind of coffee you like hot, is there a corresponding cold brew version that you would like, or actually should you be cold brewing different kinds of coffees than the ones you usually drink? For the nerds, everything is pretty well extracted and pretty evenly extracted here. Yes, the dark roast is slightly more extracted than anything else. Unsurprising, darker roasts are a little easier to extract, but it's not massive and everything is pretty well extracted. Just so you know, we care, we check, we want to make sure it's all good. For the absolute nerds, we're falling between 20.5 and around 22.5, 6, 7, 8. Somewhere up there is the sort of upper end of things, but that's the sort of band of extraction that we're aiming for. So nice strength to them as well, considering the ratio that we're working with. Oh, and we will of course offer you an audio track with none of my slurping in it. If you change the audio language to American, you won't hear me slurp the coffee if you don't like that sort of a thing. And I don't, so I get it. I get it. Let's have a taste. The light roasted coffee. This is, I think, a Guatemalan coffee. It's quite light-bodied. It's quite elegant. Some fruit in there, nice and sweet, a little acid. How's the cold brew? If I'm honest, it just lacks a bit of texture in there compared to, I think, what you can get. There is some acids. So again, if you really don't want acidity, maybe don't lean towards light roasted washed coffees for your cold brew. That's probably not news to you. The fruit in there doesn't feel as kind of ripe and sweet and good, which is interesting. It's not unpleasant, but it just feels like it would be terrible if you added something to it, be it sugar or a dairy alternative. I really feel like that's just not how these kind of coffees best express, if I'm honest. Let's move into the medium. Now, as a hot coffee, more body, more sweet. This is very much in that kind of caramels end of things. A little chocolate in there too. Very soft, very friendly, not overly complex, but just nice. Cold brew, notably quite sweet. Still just a little acids, not a lot. In some ways it's almost fruitier than the hot brew, which is kind of confusing. It's got a little bit of that fruitiness that you kind of get in chocolate, a little almost berryness in there, a little something sweet, interesting, verging on a kind of classic cold brew flavor. I get it. Now, the dark roast. Quite a dominant bitterness here. You brew dark roast with hot water, you do bring out a lot of those bitter compounds. That's the sort of primary experience I have here. Tons of body, not very much acidity or complexity there. How's the cold brew? Interesting. Surprising, actually. Here's one where the cold water has deleted a bunch of stuff in quite a pleasant way. Minimal acidity again, not very much fruit, but that attack of bitterness is gone. There's plenty of body and texture to the cold brew, but it's just not that harsh. I think, if I'm honest, I might prefer this to the hot. And I probably would prefer that to this brewed hot over ice, because you'd still get a bunch of those more bitter compounds in there. Cold brew has struggled over the years a little bit with the reputation as being the place to dump stuff that doesn't taste great, because you don't get as much of the coffee coming through. And I'm not saying that's true, but I am saying if I had some dark roasted coffee and I really did want to drink it, but I don't really like dark roasted coffee, I think cold brew is actually a pretty good way to go about that if you like cold coffee. I'm surprised at how much I like that compared to the dark roast that I just personally don't really enjoy that much. Now, the natural process. This is a classic Central American style natural process coffee. Really tons of slightly tropical fruit in there, still a little bit of berry fruit in there too. Not overly wild and funky and aggressively fermenty, but still definitely a natural profile if you're familiar with those kind of coffees. The cold brew version is genuinely very surprising. I don't know how else to say that. There's more acidity in this cold brew than there is in the hot brew, which feels weird. Or maybe the balance has shifted, I can't work that out. It's very juicy. It's less fermenty. It's just like a little bit like candy, juicy, sweet. I'm surprised again. I'm not a huge enjoyer of classic natural coffee sort of profile lots. That's just me. I don't really like the fermented flavors in there, the wilder end of stuff. This is quite fun. I'm quite surprised again at the transformation through this brew method. I'm not sure that this would definitely hold true with most traditional cold brew methods though, where you do have this kind of strong under extraction, because you tend to get a little bit less character. Where we've benchmarked this technique against, say, toddy, we found that the body tends to match, but we just get a little bit more complexity and character coming through from the higher extraction and from using less coffee and grinding finer. Last one, the thermal shock, the more kind of heavily post-harvest processed coffee. It's a very unusual cup, hot. If you've tasted these kind of coffees, they're a little bit love-hate. I'm curious though, with those kind of very heady aromas and those kind of more fermented flavors, what comes through in the cold brew? Not very much. And actually I was surprised at how extracted this one was. It was a little bit under 22% extraction, if you love those sort of numbers. So it's not empty from a lack of extraction, but it's interesting that this is a pretty light roast and they just seem to offer less to cold water, which is just kind of interesting. I think if you were spending the money that these typically cost, and they are usually much more expensive as sort of coffees, I don't think I'd put them anywhere near cold brew, because I feel like even if I extracted them pretty fully, I'm still not getting the aromatic and sort of flavor experience that they offer. So for me, this was super interesting. I would say, generally speaking, light roasts I would avoid as cold brew, no matter how strongly you feel that light roasts are great. I think if you want that flavor profile cold, you have to brew hot over ice. Whereas as you drift darker or towards natural process coffees, I'm quite surprised at how much I like the cold brew versions, considering I don't traditionally enjoy cold brew. I hope this is just useful guidance when you think about what you like hot and how you might apply that to what you want to drink as cold coffee. So that brings us to the end of our exploration of the world of cold brew. Now, I hope if you make cold brew regularly at home, maybe you'll try some of what we do. You don't have to go as far as buying the fining agent. It is pretty widely available. We'll leave a link to it. It's not an affiliate link. It's just here it is if you want to give it a try. You absolutely don't have to, but we like the results, so we thought we'd share it with you. We hope that it encourages you to think a little bit more about how you use your coffee, about getting good value from your coffee. That's always something that's really important to us. And we'd love to hear how you get on with it and how you are thinking about selecting coffees. If this has encouraged you to cold brew a different kind of coffee and you have an interesting result, well, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. And if you have any other feedback or thoughts on this technique, we'd love to hear those too. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.